Welcome to Not Two Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. The Rise of the Chinese People's Communes by Anna Louise Strong, Part 5. Winter consolidation. As the autumn upsurge carried 99% of China's peasants into the communes, the Central Committee of the Communist Party prepared for consolidation. They have a technique in popular drives which can best be given in the terms of battle. Any swift advance in battle or social organization produces rough edges. The foremost troops outrun the main force and take posts where the new front cannot yet be stabilized. The time to halt them is not when they are rushing forward, for this advance helps the general offensive, and nobody yet knows how far the main force will go. Countless new ideas will be born of this popular initiative. 100 flowers will bloom, and this is the time to let them. But the drive has natural limits, and a pause comes for regrouping. The general staff must be ready to fix the new front line to which the main forces may quickly advance, and which they can firmly hold. Some of the foreposts can be fortified, the rest drawn back for safety, and the rear brought up. A new front is consolidated for some later advance. The time to consolidate the communes was clearly early December. The peasants had all joined, the harvests were all in, and 4 winter months lay ahead for tidying details of organization. The Central Committee prepared. Through November, Chairman Mao and other party leaders moved south through Hunan, studying communes in the province which had organized earliest. In early November, they conferred with local party leaders in Zhengzhou. In late November, they held wider conferences in the Wuhan cities, and provincial leaders from all over China met. Anyone acquainted with methods of leadership in China knew that a Central Committee meeting was building up in Wuhan. It took place from November 28 to December 10. The most important item on the agenda was modestly entitled, quote, "Some Questions Concerning the People's Communes," end quote. The first thing about this resolution that strikes an outsider is that it was adopted after practically all the peasants had already joined the communes. It was therefore not an attempt to push the people into the communes, but an attempt to consolidate the communes' work. The second thing clear to any conscientious newsgatherer is that, while this resolution is much longer and contains much more detail than did the earlier resolution of August 29, it makes no change in the basic line. All attempts of the foreign press to claim that the communes had, quote, failed, end quote, or had, quote, backtracked, end quote, were sheer invention. The party suggested that some local organizations might profitably backtrack from too advanced positions, but had not itself backtracked from the August position. It had gone forward, carrying the main forces to a new, stabilized front. The third thing that especially delighted me as a writer was the beauty of clear style in which the resolution is expressed. I quote in full the first paragraph, which describes the communes more clearly, briefly, and beautifully than any words I could choose. Quote, "In 1958, a new social organization appeared, fresh as the morning sun above the broad horizon of East Asia. This was the large-scale People's Commune in the rural areas of our country, which combines industry, agriculture, trade, education, and military affairs, and in which government administration and commune management are integrated. Since their first appearance, the People's Communes, with their immense vitality, have attracted widespread attention," end quote. After this terse, yet comprehensive description of the form, the next paragraph noted that, quote, "the movement has grown rapidly," end quote, and that, quote, "within a few months, starting with the summer of 1958, the more than 740,000 agricultural producers' cooperatives reorganized themselves into 26,000 people's communes," end quote. And that this means, quote, "over 120 million households, or more than 99% of all China's peasant households," end quote. From this point, one must condense and comment, for the document covers 24 legal-sized typewritten pages. The commune is defined as, quote, the basic unit of the socialist social structure of our country, end quote. And, quote, at the same time, the basic unit of state power, end quote. Its, quote, obvious benefit, end quote, is stated to be that, quote, labor power and means of production can be managed in a unified way on a larger scale, end quote. Already, all kinds of local activity have developed under, quote, unified leadership, end quote. Quote, tens of thousands of small factories have mushroomed, end quote. Quote, large numbers of community dining rooms, nurseries, kindergartens, homes of respect for the aged have emancipated women from thousands of years of kitchen drudgery, end quote. The, quote, mass of peasants have begun to receive wages and are able to eat without paying, end quote. This is the, quote, most reliable form of social insurance. For the peasants, all this is epoch-making news, end quote. The importance of this new form goes beyond the increase of living standards for the peasants. Quote, it has shown the country the way to the gradual industrialization of the rural areas, the way to the gradual transition from the socialist principle, quote, to each according to his work, end quote, to the communist principle, quote, to each according to his needs, end quote. The way gradually to lessen and finally to eliminate the difference between town and country, between worker and peasant, between mental and manual labor, and the way gradually to lessen and finally to eliminate the internal function of the state, end quote. From this clear and glowing description, Western commentators in Hong Kong hastened to file cables, which told the world that the Chinese communists had changed their policy, were dropping the communes because they had failed, and were firing Mao from the presidency because of that failure. How was such an absurd conclusion ever reached? In part, they reached the conclusion by wishful thinking. In part, because the Western press had already built up a fantastic picture of the people's communes, and the resolution made it clear that their picture was incorrect. They had portrayed militarized gangs of slave labor, living in barracks, with complete and purposeful smashing of the family, and with all people eating from the same pot and dressed from the same cotton bolts. A slave system, an anthill life. The resolution smashed that picture, hence the Western press declared it abandoned the communes. Some sections need special attention. Those on production, on distribution, on family life, on the military form. The section on, quote, production, end quote, makes it clear that communes are no longer, quote, farming cooperatives, end quote, but develop industry and farming and trade, quote, both for consumption and for exchange, end quote. For farming, the methods advocated are, quote, deep plowing and intensive cultivation, end quote, with reduction of acreage but bigger total crop. The goal set is, quote, a ton to a ton and a half of grain, end quote, per capita within a, quote, comparatively short period, end quote. China had, in 1958, passed the half-ton mark per capita, which was twice what she ever had before. In a lyric passage, well worth noting, the future ideal for China's farming is stated. By the, quote, basic farmland system, end quote, tried in several areas in 1958, acreage is to be steadily reduced, but each acre is to be, quote, garden farmed, end quote, with more water, manure, cultivation, until China feeds herself from 1/3 of her present farmland, gives another third to, quote, fallow rotation, pasturage and green manure, end quote, and the rest to, quote, afforestation, reservoirs, flowers, shrubs, and trees, to turn our whole land into a garden, end quote. Communes, quote, should go in for industry in a big way, end quote, according to local conditions. They should produce, first of all, for their own needs, and also for commodity production, quote, on as wide a scale as possible, end quote, switching an appropriate part of the labor force, quote, step by step, from agriculture to industry to develop fertilizer, insecticides, farm implements and machinery, building materials, the processing of agricultural produce, manufacturing of sugar, textiles, paper, mining, metallurgy, electric power, and other light and heavy industries, end quote. This is a clear call for widest development of industry on a decentralized plan. In addition to the big, centrally owned industries, which of course still continue to expand under central government ownership, the communes are to develop, under local ownership, every kind of industry their conditions and labor power permit. the people in each commune are to benefit directly by developing all their resources they can. This is the essentially new aspect of China's communes. Following China's tradition of decentralized social control, they combine economic and government power on township or county scale. Federations of communes on a county scale, quote, have power to deploy, end quote, a certain part of the manpower for constructive undertakings on county scale or even beyond the county. This permits irrigation works and afforestation, the building of railroads and highways, beginning with the county but going beyond it. One might call it, quote, the socialism in one country, end quote, plan. The section on distribution makes it clear that, for the present, the wage system is to be stressed. From the net income, after taxes and production costs are met, a considerable proportion is to be set aside as, quote, accumulation fund, end quote, for new development. But the amount paid to members is to be large enough to keep wages rising year by year. Members' income consists both of wages according to work and of free supply according to needs. But the resolution warns against putting too many items too soon on the free list. Quote, wages must take first place, end quote. They must, quote, increase faster than the system of free supply, end quote. Any attempt to replace, quote, distribution by work, end quote, with, quote, distribution by need, end quote, is branded as, quote, trying to enter communism before conditions are mature, end quote. A, quote, utopian concept which cannot succeed, end quote. This is doubtless one of the sections which caused Western commentators to say that the communes were, quote, backtracking, end quote. A comparison of this resolution with that of August will show that the Central Committee never advocated much, quote, free supply, end quote. That even the, quote, free food, end quote, came through peasant desire rather than through any party demand. It was accepted by the party because the demand was so universal. During the autumn upsurge, however, there had been a wide tendency of communes to compete in the number of things that they put on the, quote, free list, end quote, until this included clothing, theater tickets, barber, baths, fuel, and many other amenities. This tendency was discouraged by the resolution. This is no statement of failure. This is the pulling back of the forward posts that have outrun the line which the main forces can hold. Anyone acquainted with organization, especially in the field of cooperatives, knows that it is easy for a local enthusiast to get people to vote for a large free list. The people with large families vote for it because it is in their interests. The working couples without children also vote for it because they are not willing to appear selfish among their neighbors. But anyone also knows that those same working couples will become unhappy when they see their wages diminished by the need of clothing all the neighbors' children, and that friction will grow over how fast those children use up clothes. It is against such trouble that an experienced Central Committee must safeguard local enthusiasts. Private property in certain things remains and is specified. People's houses, furniture, clothing, and bank savings remain private property, and this includes trees around the houses, small gardens, small poultry, and small tools. This was also a needed safeguard, for trouble had arisen through different interpretations on this. In Section 5, which discusses the way of life, the Communist Party felt the need of arguing with Mr. Dulles and pointing out to him that the communes do not destroy the home or the family. Nurseries, kindergartens, public dining rooms first appeared under capitalism, and none of them are compulsory under the communes, but are organized as conveniences. The commune does indeed destroy, quote, the patriarchal home, end quote, says the resolution, but creates, quote, the democratic home, end quote. As far as the Western reader goes, this argument might have been better put. For while the patriarchal control is indeed destroyed by the individual wage direct to the worker, and by the conveniences which permit the woman to work, the Chinese-style large family, which includes 3 generations, still exists in all the communes I have seen, and is still planned for in all the housing projects. This combination of grandparents, parents, and children under one roof is what the West rather loosely calls, quote, patriarchal, end quote, and is by no means destroyed, as I have shown in the preceding chapter. The resolution breaks new ground by demanding, for the first time in China, a basic 8-hour day in the rural areas. This was another detail made necessary by excesses of local enthusiasts, and of local peasants themselves, who tried to get everything done at once by working unduly long hours. Quote, 8 hours for work and 2 for study, end quote, is now set as standard in both city and country. This is part of the inclusion of industry in the Communes program. In special emergencies, the hours may be temporarily extended, but, quote, the way out of the present labor shortage, end quote, is flatly stated to be, quote, not long hours, but better tools and organization of labor, end quote. In the future, quote, 6 hours and even shorter, end quote, is the goal for the working day. The Central Committee also feels the need of arguing with Dulles about, quote, the military form, end quote. The resolution explains that what is meant is, quote, the kind of disciplined collective work that is seen both in the army and in the factory, end quote, and that large-scale farming also requires. The organization of the militia, which has been noted abroad as, quote, militarization, end quote, is rather impatiently declared to be necessary because, quote, the imperialist pirates, end quote, still try to wipe out the Chinese state. If Americans are surprised that Chinese thus judge their intentions, let them recall that for more than a century, foreign troops stood on Chinese soil, and American armed forces still stand on China's Taiwan today, while the 7th Fleet is visible along the China coast, and American sidewinders recently brought down a Chinese plane well inside the mainland. The militia is civilian in control, part of the production teams, and under the commune, a kind of county home guard. Quote, there must be both democracy and discipline in the communes, end quote, says Section 6. Quote, both centralism and democracy in all organizations, including the militia, end quote. Quote, it is impermissible, end quote, to use the military form or militia, quote, to impair, in the least, the democratic life, end quote. The section concludes with words that deserve place in the anthology of democracy for their clear expression and sharp definition. Quote, the People's Commune is the basic organization of our country's state power. Only by fully ensuring democracy in the commune will it be possible to create, throughout the country, a vigorous and lively political situation, in which there are both centralism and democracy, both discipline and freedom, both unity of will and personal ease of mind, end quote. Such was the official statement of the form and goal of the People's Communes in the December 10 resolution. The resolution also stated that the coming winter months should go to, quote, tidying up, end quote, the communes, that every province should set up, quote, inspection teams, end quote, of 1,000 or 2,000 members to visit communes, spread news of the best methods, and criticize shortcomings. In Beijing, the government ministries geared themselves to the communes. The first offer by the Ministry of Metallurgy to furnish blueprints for, quote, steel rolling equipment for use on farms, end quote, sounded fantastic. It was followed quickly by other offers from universities and machine building plants of designs and equipment by which communes could roll their own steel. The most interesting was from a metalworks in Guizhou, which advertised a steel rolling machine, quote, weighing only 500 pounds, costing only 2,500 yuan, needing only 10 kilowatts of electric power or a small steam engine, end quote, to produce on the farms, quote, angular bars, square bars, or steel sheets of several kinds, end quote. The notice added, quote, easy to operate in any commune, end quote. Farmers who last summer made their emergency local railroads of wood or porcelain could now roll rails from homemade steel and make steel for building construction. The Ministry of Chemical Industry announced, quote, cheap and easy, end quote, processes for making sulfuric acid, synthetic ammonia, fertilizer of many kinds, and even synthetic rubber in communes. In early autumn of 1958, several communes began to make synthetic rubber from sweet potatoes. The number has doubtless grown. A few hours south of Beijing, the synthetic rubber works of Shangchuan Commune took only 2 months to build, cost only $125,000, and was expected to return an annual profit twice the total investment costs. Almost any commune with excess sweet potatoes could buy itself a rubber factory, unless it itself preferred to use the money for a power plant or railway spur. This was only one of 100 ways communes began to use surplus labor in the slack time between farm operations in order to grow collectively rich. Railroads also began to gear themselves to the communes. The Minister of Railways told me how arrangements made with communes helped solve the bottlenecks in freight handling caused by the bumper crop in summer and the steel drive in the autumn. A small freight station worked out a technique that quickly spread to other such stations. By arrangement with a local commune, a production gang of 100 stalwart men worked in the fields within whistle call. When a freight train arrived, the whistle blew. The gang downed tools and went to the railway station and unloaded or loaded the train. In some cases, they were able to unload and reload cars without detaching them from the train, doing the work while the locomotive went for water and fuel. The minister said he believed China already has a record of fewer empty cars and less wasted time in freight handling than any country in the world. From all these relations growing between the communes and the central government ministries, future lines of China's Great Leap Forward begin to appear. China was industrializing on 3 levels: the big, the medium, and the small. Big modern industries, like Anshan Steelworks, owned by the central government, would make the steel and other products for big central projects. Medium-sized industries, owned by provincial governments, would supply provincial needs. Small industries, owned by the communes, would fill in the local gaps, producing quickly the things the peasants need or the commodities processed from the farms. It has always been assumed that big industry is more efficient than small industry. Nobody really knows. No fair test was ever made. Big industry beat small industry under capitalism. Was it by greater efficiency, or by monopoly control of raw materials and also of scientific brains, for which big industry paid much more? When scientists compete in, quote, rolling mills for farms, end quote, we shall have a test. Quote, efficiency, end quote, moreover, is a word of many meanings. An industry which displaces populations or keeps men part-time idle is not socially efficient, even if it makes more per man-hour. Industry whose workers live on their farm and diversify their labor has the advantage of small capitalization and maximum use of manpower. It also offers a more balanced human life. The many meanings of the word, quote, efficiency, end quote, were illustrated for me in Liangzhou Commune near Guangzhou, a commune without fame, which I visited only because the health resort in which I spent a winter month was located on its lands. I was surprised to learn that it had 8, quote, paper mills, end quote. Paper mills to me implied fairly large enterprise. That a single commune should erect 8 of them meant to me either an unusual demand for paper or an economic waste. I visited one of the paper mills and ceased to be surprised. At one end of a large rice field, on a rise of land against a hill, stood a wooden structure, a shed with walls shoulder high and the upper part open, topped by an overhanging roof. Inside, there was a brick stove with a metal boiler, and a dipping vat with a wire netting for lifting and draining pulp. Outside the building, a large pool had been made of boulders with the chinks filled in by cement. This was the total equipment needed to turn rice straw into paper of several kinds and colors. The manager explained that the 7 other paper mills were of even simpler construction, and were in the hills where there were wastes from bamboo. Why did they have 8 paper mills instead of 1? I asked. He explained that all 8 cost less than 10,000 yuan, $4,000, and it was much cheaper and more convenient to make 8 near the various sources of rice straw and bamboo waste than to haul the bulky refuse to the mill. The purpose of these mills, he said, was not to make a lot of paper, but to use up all their waste and make all the paper they needed, as well as to make some income by selling paper. They expected, on the investment of $4,000, and by the labor of some 85 people, to make about $100,000 during the year. In the present state of China's transport, paper supply and wage scale, 8 small paper mills were an efficient means of meeting a local problem. In the future, they might not always be. Liangzhou Commune gave me another indication of the relativity of, quote, efficiency, end quote, in its first power plant. Because of its success, the manager said, they were now starting work on 24. 24 power plants in one commune sounded fantastic. Why not get all the power from one larger plant? The manager replied that the commune was large, about 100 miles by 60 miles in area, and much of it was unused hillside without people, and the cost of poles and high-tension wire was considerable, while the cost of the small power plant was small. It was much cheaper to build a small power plant for every populated spot. So indeed it proved when I saw the power plant. A small irrigation ditch had been diverted to send a stream of some 20 inches in cross-section through a wooden flume, where it turned continually a homemade wooden turbine. From this, a belt of woven hemp connected with a motor and a switchboard. The cost of the project, including motor, switchboard, and wiring to 400 houses, was less than $4,000. It furnished only about 50 watts of light bulb per house, but this was brighter than kerosene and also cheaper. Quote, "We can pay for it by 1 year's kerosene bills," end quote, the manager said. These are the simple efficiencies with which the communes begin, but they do not stop with these. They go on to bigger industries, in some cases with incredible speed. 4 farmers sat in my hotel room in Beijing in late December and told me about their communes in 4 different parts of China. They were all delegates to the, quote, Congress of Outstanding Units, end quote, i.e. representing the best communes. All of them had been illiterate 10 years ago. Now, all were managers of big business. A commune is big business, harder to manage than a single big factory, for it includes many factories, as well as farming, trade, and the manifold details of public kitchens and nurseries, and other amenities of life. Some of the comments came with a shock of surprise to my mind, accustomed to other ways of figuring. Han Sen, a heavy-built man in a blue shirt and light brown sweater, managed a big commune in Jilin, Manchuria, which covered an entire county. I asked why they made it so big, and he replied that it was, quote, simpler that way, end quote. He added, quote, "We needed a county reservoir big enough for a large area," end quote. This seemed a good enough reason till I asked what the reservoir would cost, and Han answered that it wouldn't cost much because they had their own cement plant. He added, quote, "We already built 82 small reservoirs in 1958, and some of them didn't cost anything at all," end quote. Intrigued by his total omission of labor costs, I asked who paid for the roads, the province or the county. Quote, "Nobody pays for roads," end quote, said Han cheerfully. Quote, "We just make them," end quote. I later learned from more sophisticated officials that Han's debonair view of roads was not quite correct. Through highways of provincial importance are built by provincial highway departments. County roads are built by the county, farm roads by the farm on which they lie. But Han was correct in assuming that, if the commune included the entire county, the farmers would, quote, just make, end quote, most of its roads. It was also intriguing to learn from Han that by taking over the county, the farmers, quote, saved, end quote, about 1 million yuan in county taxes. Quote, "Not entirely," end quote, admitted Han. Quote, "Of course we have to use that money for schools and welfare the same as the county did. But we save at least 200 official salaries, and all those, quote, liberated, end quote, officials now work in industry and increase the commune's income. The county tax board was just dissolved, for the commune keeps books and pays all the taxes in one lump sum," end quote. Taxes, he said, were about 5 million, from a total farm income of 30 million, plus an industrial income that wasn't calculated yet. Industry was mostly new, and wouldn't be taxed this year. Han seemed husky, efficient, and with much still to learn about cost accounting. What farmer wouldn't have? The prize story in that group, and in all the groups I met, came from Guo Peifeng, a black-jacketed 46-year-old farmer from the Shaanxi Mountains, with a lot of giddy badges of merit on his coat. The idea that Chinese all wear blue denim today as a badge of uniformity is untrue. Blue used to be usual peasants' wear and thus became Liberation Army wear, and is still widely worn. But other colors appear with a rising standard of living, and the girls especially blossom out in flowered prints and even in, quote, perfumed cottons, end quote, one of the new fashions. But let us return to Guo. What drew my attention to Guo was that last October, in the Shaanxi mountain area of his red flag commune, some millions of dollars had just begun coming out of the earth. The area had never been good in farming. Despite all efforts, it could not match the lowlands with their fertile fields. But coal existed. When 14 townships combined on September 10 in a commune with 75,000 people, the county turned over to them 20 small coal mines. There was also much iron ore lying on the surface, undeveloped for want of technical know-how, capital, and initiative. Quote, "When the big steel drive began in October," end quote, said Guo, quote, "we began to dig out iron ore. We sent delegates to steel mills to learn how to do it. We built one furnace and then another, and then we shot a big Sputnik," end quote. This is a special drive to see how much can be done in 24 hours. And now we have 17 ironworks with 20,000 workers. When I left home in early December, we had made 76,000 tons of iron and 3,500 of steel. The government buys it at 200 yuan a ton for first quality and 168 for second grade, and some of our first iron was third grade and we smelt it over again for steel, end quote. I did a bit of calculation and said, quote, "You must have made 7 to 10 millions from iron in 6 or 7 weeks," end quote. Guo replied placidly that it was, quote, "certainly millions. The accountants must say how much. There are expenses, but the ore is there for taking, and the coal is open face, and the workers are fed by the harvest for a whole year, and can wait for wages till we sell the iron, and the government lends machines and blasts and power. So expenses are not much," end quote. Quote, "How much capital to start," end quote, I asked. Guo worked it out. The commune treasury put up 18,000 yuan, and the state bank loaned 20,000, and the people, quote, "contributed," end quote, 12,000 in money, and also 5,000 timbers and 400,000 fire brick. Quote, "There's good material for brick in the hills, and they went and got it," end quote, said Guo. It appeared that on an investment of 50,000 yuan, some $20,000 in cash, plus timbers and fire brick, they had created 17 ironworks with millions of income in less than 2 months. I put this up to Guo, and he said that it was right. So I asked, quote, "Do the ironworks belong to the commune or to the state?" End quote. Quote, "To the commune, of course," end quote, said Guo. Quote, "But the commune is the lower basic unit of the state," end quote. Quote, "What do you do with those millions?" end quote, I persisted. Quote, "Do you divide them among the members or send them to Beijing?" End quote. Guo patiently explained that of course the state bank would get its loan paid, and the people would get the contributions paid. Quote, "They all got receipts," end quote. But nobody would take back money this year, for everyone agreed all the money must go to expand and modernize the works. They had started with many small furnaces that one man could build in a day, and that made only a ton of iron a day. Now they had bigger furnaces, making 5 tons of heat. But the works are far from modern. Before spring, they must be improved. Quote, "We can't spare 20,000 workers for iron when the spring sowing begins," end quote, said Guo. Here was a commune manager who made millions in a few weeks from an initial capital of $20,000, and who put them all back into production without worrying about details of ultimate ownership, but only how best to apportion labor between farming and iron. So I inquired for more sophisticated officials in Beijing. Who gets those millions? Does iron ore belong to the township or to the nation? Can a single commune enrich itself beyond its neighbors on publicly owned iron ore? Nobody worried about it, and the answers they gave were about what Guo had given. Iron ore was certainly the property of the nation. The millions would certainly go to the commune, and not to Beijing, because, quote, "rural development is what the country needs," end quote. The commune would not unduly outstrip its neighbors by monopolizing a national resource. Some differences among communes would continue to exist. How would all this be adjusted? There were many ways. The present funds would go, as Guo said, to modernize the works, and also to raise wages of iron workers. Later, workers might come from other communes if the works grew. Taxes might redress any imbalance. Details were for the future to settle. That was about all. I told a leading communist, a friend of mine from Yunnan, what I thought of communes. I went overboard in enthusiasm for this organization that made millions on $20,000 capital in a few weeks, and could, quote, "just make roads and 82 reservoirs without cost." He pulled me up. Fortunately for China, the Chinese Communist Party is more cool-headed than I. Quote, "We put it this way. Are the communes good, or are they not good?" End quote. I stared at him, and he continued, quote, "We think they are good, but it will take us 10 years to test." End quote. Smiling at my deflation, he continued, quote, "You have been seeing the best communes, the ones that send delegates to Beijing, the outstanding units which set the example for the rest. The great potential, you notice, undoubtedly exists. But there are also communes which voted themselves free food, yet do not have enough harvest to feed themselves till the next crop. These will have to be helped by the state. There are other communes who have established a wage scale, but do not have enough surplus funds to pay these wages for very long. We think the communes are the form for us, but undoubtedly there will be some failures this winter. This does not matter. We shall all be learning from the failures, and they will reorganize and finally succeed." End quote. I recalled how Changshi Commune in Guangdong and the Great Drive in Henan had been built on the lessons of previous failures. If all of China thus learned, both from successes and from failures, they were indeed unbeatable. The task for the winter, said my friend, is to, quote, "tidy up," end quote, the organization everywhere, so that successes may be many and failures few. The great bulk of communes, he said, were neither the big successes nor the ones which had courted failure by voting free food when they had not enough. The big majority really had enough food for the first time in their history, but did not have much surplus for wages, and certainly could not afford waste. Immediate demands were therefore these. First, avoid waste. Most communes have voted free food. Never in history have Chinese peasants eaten freely. Quote, "Who knows how much they will eat? Nobody knows. We know that 1 extra pound of pork per person per year will wipe out all of our pork export, unless we quickly get more pigs. We know that even a small waste, multiplied by 600 million, can be a catastrophe." End quote. Next, management. To manage a big commune is harder than to manage a big industry. It is more complicated, for it includes industry, farming, and the amenities of daily life. We have 26,000 communes, and their managers are peasants who were illiterate a few years ago. They are honest and shrewd and trusted because they were elected by the members, but they are not experienced in big affairs. Because of this, there will be failures, which can only be offset if everyone is watchful and ready to help. Quote, "Then the communes must quickly develop commodity production. Nearly all communes have enough food, unless they waste it, but very few communes have much surplus besides. The farm cooperatives did not pay wages. They gave advances against harvest and then divided the harvest. The communes announce wages, even though small. They do not realize how fast these wages will eat up their surplus. They must at once develop commodity products in order to pay wages until harvest is in." End quote. It was clear why the Communist Party devoted the 4 months of winter to, quote, "tidying up," end quote. As the winter advanced and reports came in from inspection committees, I began to glimpse the extent of the problems. I noted, for instance, the case of a former cooperative, now organized as a production team in a commune, which had kept back and hidden a large quantity of grain, because they were afraid the commune would not have enough to last till the harvest, and they wanted to make sure for their own dining room. I was surprised when my Chinese friend suggested, not the disciplining of the team which had hidden the grain, but an improvement of commune practice. Quote, "Fear of hunger is natural, and suspicion is natural until people are used to working together," end quote, they said. Quote, "The commune should avoid suspicion from the start, by seeing that everyone knows where the grain is kept and how much there is. Probably, the grain should be stored in the areas that will eat it and checked out by the local dining room and the commune officials combined. The danger is that a small bad practice like holding out on grain by a group can soon become corruption and bribery of individuals who hide the action. It must be checked before it grows," end quote. Despite abuses that indicate the Chinese peasants are human, that rivalries and suspicions occur, and inefficient managers exist, my conviction grew that the people's communes were one of the great inventions of this era, that they combine the economic potential of the early American westward drive and its local initiative with the social planning of socialism. For as winter advanced, I noted that the previous year's experience of Anhui province and the digging of a canal network had touched off the 4 adjacent provinces of the North China Plain. Shandong, Hebei, Henan, and Jiangsu had all begun building canal systems like Anhui's. Henan was digging canals in 40 areas. Serious talk had begun of joining canals of 5 provinces with the Yellow River, the Huai, the Grand Canal, and the Yangtze, making an interlacing waterway of rivers and canals to regulate water and give transportation to the entire North China Plain. Meanwhile, on the great arid cattle-breeding lands of Inner Mongolia, which run from northwest of Beijing to the Soviet border, where herdsmen have roamed for thousands of years, more nomads were entering the communes than had ever joined the farming cooperatives. They were developing ore deposits, coal mines, leather tanneries, brick and tile kilns, ironworks, and carpentry. Settlements were growing up around schools, stores, clinics, libraries, and community dining halls. Ice roads were made by clearing snow from frozen rivers. Traffic on these was faster than summer traffic. For 150 miles along the Liao River, tractors pulled 5 or 10 sleighs behind them, taking cattle products to the cities and bringing back to the former nomads the city goods. Sichuan, China's most populous province, with 62 million people in the warm southwest, reported that its 4,000 communes now owned 400,000 industrial enterprises, most of them set up since September. And over in Qinghai, on the edge of Tibet, the nomads of the Tangla Mountains, roving 14 to 16,000 feet above sea level, formed a commune and organized their first settlement around their first school. The school, with 81 children of Tibetan nationality, opened with songs and dances to honor the new commune. The big achievement they chose to wire to Beijing was that, quote, all of the children came in new clothes, end quote. Herdsmen, who in the past were lucky if they got a new patch per year on old clothing, had chosen to celebrate their new future by giving all the children new clothes. On New Year's Day, the papers were full of the 1958 statistics. It was truly a great and glorious year. Production had doubled in the major items of farming and industry, in grain, in cotton, in iron, in coal, and machines. The water conservation campaign had expanded irrigation on 80 million acres and controlled soil erosion on 320,000 square kilometers. Changes of such magnitude had never happened in world history. The major event of the year for China, and perhaps for the world, was that most of China's 500 million farming people had voted themselves, through their communes, free food. And the major event of the day in Beijing was that the Congress of Outstanding Units, with nearly 6,000 delegates from the leading communes of China, was drawing to its final session to sum up 1958 and launch the new year. For more than a week, they had been meeting, first in a big assembly and then in smaller groups, discussing paragraph by paragraph the party resolution on communes and applying it to their local problems in every corner of China. When they first assembled on Christmas Day, I had predicted that Mao Zedong, who for 2 months had been absent from Beijing, touring the rural areas and holding conferences, would, quote, have to return, end quote, for these farmers. But when I went to the final session on New Year's Day, I had forgotten my prediction. I went to see the farmers without thought of Chairman Mao. In the new stadium, designed for economy and compactness, sat some 6,000 of China's best farmers, mostly men and mostly young, but with a fair sprinkling of older men and of women. Most, but not all, wore new suits of blue cotton, and all wore scarlet badges of the Congress. They all had printed copies of the program. I looked at mine. There were 7 items. I wondered how long it would be. They began at 4 sharp with the national anthem, then a brief chairman's report, then the, quote, 10 proposals for agriculture in 1959, end quote. The first proposal was to raise grain to 525 million tons, some 40% higher than in 1958. Other proposals were similar in other fields. Each proposal was separately voted twice, in an unusual routine. The chairman asked, quote, any dissent or amendment, end quote? A pause followed by shouts of, quote, no, end quote. Then the chairman asked, quote, who are for it, end quote? All arms shot high in air with clenched fists. Each proposal was thus twice approved, first by refusal to dissent or amend, then by affirmative fists. Telegrams of greetings to Chairman Mao and to the Central Committee were next approved, and to the, quote, fighters of the Fujian Front, end quote, reminding us that even as they organized the land for farming, there was war on the coast towards Taiwan and the American 7th Fleet. The next item was listed as, quote, certificates and badges, end quote, and my eyes turned to the great heaps of certificates that were stacked in front of the chairman's rostrum. They were certificates of merit, thousands of them, to be presented to several thousand leading communes, engraved in colors in gold and signed by Zhou Enlai for the State Council, to be hung in communes' offices as a challenge to their neighbors and themselves. To save time, they were in bundles to be distributed by provinces, not individual units. Before presentation began, a stir came in the Tribune, and Li Tuchuan, the woman Minister of Health who was acting chairman, said, quote, we have all hoped that Chairman Mao and the party leaders might be with us. They are here, end quote. As simply as that, Mao Zedong, Chu Te, Liu Xiaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and others came through the rear door to the Tribune, and everyone rose, applauding. The leaders did not stop in the Tribune. They began to circle the stadium at the middle level, on the wide circular aisle from which the gallery stairs open. Only then did I notice that there was no division between the Tribune and audience. They were all on one circular aisle. The leaders went slowly, exchanging brief greetings by glance, by a few words, by a motion of hand. The entire hall followed their passage, with hands applauding, eyes seeking, and bodies swaying toward Mao. When the leaders had come full circle to the Tribune again, they sat down, and the program went on. The certificates and badges were given out. The Secretary of the Congress made the final summing up. Mao and the party leaders listened as part of the audience. None of them spoke a word. For a time, I kept waiting a bit restlessly for Mao to make a speech, to sum up, or at least to say some words of greeting. This did not occur. Finally, I understood that silence was a stronger message. That silence said, quote, we party leaders did our job when we passed the resolution. The present job is yours. For this, we are just the audience. We are glad to be with you here, end quote. At 5 o'clock, it was over. That final session with its 7 printed items, and with the entrance of the party leaders added, had been finished in just 1 hour. A few of the nearer delegates surged towards Mao for a final glance or handshake. The rest went swiftly out appropriate doors. They had launched the year's campaign for rural China and had received without words the blessing of their leaders. They were going home to carry the campaign through. By the time I reached the door, many autobuses had already left, and others were leaving. The new year had begun. The earth becomes a rug. Wukong. Our village ends just where the next begins. This slope joins with the next, the little streams merge with the big canals, until all earth becomes a woven rug of green, crisscrossed with streams like threads of silver, and all closely interwoven, not easily to be torn.